mission here is to help people do life different by setting rhythms and values with Jesus at the center.
And our hope is that this is a safe place for you to explore spirituality, faith, and what a relationship with Jesus looks like for you. And we say here, and we really mean it, but everybody in this room, we might not agree on everything. And very honestly, there are probably people that might not agree on anything. But our goal here is that we agree on just one thing, and that is the world needs more Jesus.
Now, Natalia already mentioned, we're wrapping up our series this morning called Relationship Goals. If you've missed any of it, I encourage you to go online, check it out, 1128community.org/on-demand. You can catch up on it. You can share it with people from there. But I'd encourage you, because what we've said all along is this isn't a marriage series. This is a relationship series. Because the reality is all of us are in relationship with somebody, whether it is a marriage or a parent or a child relationship, or maybe it's a teacher-student, maybe it's a coworker, a friendship, a neighbor. We have relationships in our lives that can benefit from learning these things that we've talked about over the last couple weeks. So as we prepared for today, and I started thinking about relationships and just how long some of them can be, I was thinking about marathons. And I wanted to share with you that, believe it or not, I accidentally ran a marathon one time. I did. I accidentally ran a marathon one time. Here's how it went. I was a freshman in college, and I was dating a girl.
Not me. I'm not a marathon runner. Let's just be very clear.
Yeah, so I was dating a girl that she was training for the Chicago Marathon, and she trained all summer long, and I was there to encourage her. I didn't train with her or anything, but I was there yeah, go you. You're doing great. And so we got to October when the Chicago Marathon is run, and I said, along with her dad and one of her sisters, we'll split up the race and we'll run a few miles with you just to be that encouragement. Because that's what a good boyfriend did, right? You ran a few miles. Well, I was the first one in the staggered running along with her. Now, what I didn't think would happen actually happened, where I started off. And we started off, and she'd set the pace, right? She'd been training for this for months and months, and so we had a good, solid pace. And most shocking thing to me when we started off was within a mile, 5-10 minutes, there were people just literally going off to the side to use the bathroom. I didn't expect this. If you've done a marathon, I guess this is normal. Anyways, it was weird, and I kept going. I pushed my way through, and then at one point, I remember, I looked over here, and I saw some random guys that I'd met at college, a few weeks before, and I was like, hey, and they were like, why is that guy running in the marathon? And these guys, they were our cross-country team guys, so they're standing there watching the run, and here I am, not a cross-country guy, running in the run, and it was a weird moment. But continuing on, I kept going, and we got to mile 5, and that's where her dad was supposed to be standing, and didn't see him. He was just supposed to hop in and start running along, and I was supposed to hop out and head to the end of the marathon there, but he wasn't there. So I was like, well, I can't just ditch her at this point. I got to keep going. So I kept going. Got to mile 10, 11, 12, still no dad. And now at this point, looking for her sister. No sister. So here I am, 11 miles in or so. And I'm thinking I don't know that I can go any further. And this thing's got another 15 miles. And I'm I just got to keep pushing. I got to do this for her. And thankfully, by the time we got to mile 19, I'm sure she's ticked at me because I'm slowing her down so much. Mile 19, her dad hops in hey, I'm here, and I'm just man, where have you been for the last 15 miles, man? Right? I was tired, and so I didn't actually run the entire marathon. I don't think I would have made it much further, but I accidentally ran 19 miles of the Chicago Marathon as a freshman in college that I had not trained for. I had not planned on. I was not ready for that. My body still hurts just thinking about it. That's how you accidentally run a marathon.
Yeah, and very honestly, not many of us can relate to Mike because not many of us accidentally run a marathon, and not many of us in this room probably choose to run one either. But for most of us, relationships can feel like a marathon. Like maybe you have that relationship where you get off to this like quick start and you really connect. Maybe you have a relationship where you hit like a test, like those first couple miles, and it's hard, but you push through. Maybe you have relationships where you're running alongside of them and you're working, doing life with them, and your pace starts to fade. Maybe you have relationships where you're like, I'm not going to give up. And maybe you even have relationships where like another friend, joins you and it rejuvenates, it reignites like the old relationship. But we've said all series long, no matter the relationship, that relationships are hard. Like the ups and the downs and the things that you just don't plan for, they're hard. Now, we are not people that train for a marathon, but marathonhandbook.com suggests that consistency is the essential, like most essential thing to running success. So being consistent in your training, that means like having speed work, long runs, races, strength training, like all the things, like a very clear plan of what you're doing in your training, and then being consistent with it. Like you can't let things go. But it's not just that. Like training for a marathon, you also have to be consistent in your nutrition, your hydration, where you put your rest days. Like it all matters.
It does matter. And this morning, just wondering this question. If consistency is essential in running, if it really matters when we want to run a marathon, like, does it really matter? And is it really essential as well in our relationships? Does consistency matter? Like, wonder if you and I were more consistent people. How would that change our relationships? How might our relationships look different? Right? Like if there was one thing that you could do consistently, and you knew, if I just do this one thing, my relationships will improve. Or if I just do this one thing repeatedly, consistently, my relationship will get better with my spouse. Or my relationship with my kid will get better. My relationship with my coworkers will get better, right? Like if you knew there was one thing that you could do consistently, would you do it? I think most of us would say, yes, sign me up, I'll do it. But here's the thing, like this is gonna sound really simple, but it's not. It's not simple. Like don't be fooled by like the simplicity of what we say today. Like it's hard. It's hard to be consistent, and we struggle with it. You already struggle with it. Like we all struggle with being consistent. But here's the thing, like if we consistently love God first, we will love others best. Let me say it again. Consistently loving God first helps us love others best. Paul, in the book of Hebrews, he's writing about faith, and he's talking about faith as this marathon, this race to be run. And he's writing it this way because the people that would have been reading this letter, they would have been familiar with like the Olympic Games. And so they would have either been spectators watching the Olympic Games or maybe competitors. Either way, they would have been familiar with the races and the Olympic Games. And so Paul's like saying like, hey, this is what it's like. Faith. It's a marathon. It's a race. And he says here in Hebrews chapter 12, it means that we better get on with it. Strip it down and start running and never quit. Like start running the race of faith. Like never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. Keep your eyes on Jesus. That's a key there. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race that we are in, that you are in. Study how he did it. Study how Jesus did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed. He always knew what the finish line looked like. That exhilarating finish in and with God. He could put up with anything along the way. He could put up with the obstacles of the cross, shame, the burden of carrying the sin of all humanity. Like, he could deal with it all, whatever it was. And so this morning, I want to suggest that if faith is the race that we're running, if faith is our marathon, relationships, which are this like marathon of their own, they might be the greatest challenge to our faith that we will ever experience. Like, most of us don't have a lot of challenge to our faith, except for relationships. Yes, there's a lot of hard things like sickness and death and financial strain and other things like that. Those are hard, but not many of us like really experience those things to the point where they challenge our faith. Most of us, we would say like, man, relationships are the hardest thing. They are the greatest challenge to my faith. And why is that? It's because people are hard to be with, right? Like, let's be honest. Some of you this morning are like, the person sitting next to me is really hard for me to sit next to right now. Some of you are thinking like, I know I've got to see this family member later today or later this week or at the family reunion, and they are hard for me. Right? Because even the people that we love the most, we get annoyed with them. They do things that tick us off. Like, we struggle with people even if we love them immensely. Even the people that we want to avoid. Maybe you're trying to avoid the person sitting next to you this morning, right? Like even those people somehow, some way seem to end up right in front of us over and over and over again, because relationships are hard. People are hard, and they present the greatest challenge to our faith.
But let's think about Jesus for a minute. So we can read about Jesus' life in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what we call the Gospels. And those authors tell us so many different stories and ways that Jesus interacted with people. And we can see that Jesus was a highly relational person. And even Jesus, we can read, had really difficult relationships. And Jesus' most difficult relationships were with religious people. And a few of you might even be able to relate with that today. So if we look in Matthew 22, Jesus, he's talking, and he's just finishing up a conversation with a Sadducee. Now, Sadducees are Jewish leaders that hold high regard to the written law. So written law is really, really important. And Jesus is just finishing up a conversation with a Sadducee, and then a Pharisee lawyer decides to chime in. Now, a Pharisee, that's somebody who held the law and traditions in high regard, and then add lawyer onto it, and we all know, some lawyers are kind of weasels, and I can make that joke because I have a lot of lawyers in my family. So we have this lawyer, and he's coming, and again, I can kind of picture this. Again, I have so many lawyers in my family who they enter into a conversation trying to get you. I know more than you. Not all the lawyers in my family, but a few. And this lawyer is coming up to Jesus. This Pharisee lawyer is coming up to Jesus, and he's trying to catch him. That's his goal with this question. This is not an easy conversation. This is not an easy relationship. And here's the thing. He's going to be asking a question about the law. Now, when we think about the law, we often think about the 10 Commandments from the Old Testament. Well, it's not just those. There are 600 613 Old Testament laws that this Pharisee lawyer would have been thinking about. And I guarantee you, he probably knew them all. And so he's not just asking about the 10 Commandments, but he's asking about these 613 laws when he's talking to Jesus.
And to be clear, this is Matthew 22. So what's on the screen is not correct. So if you're following along in your Bibles, like Matthew 22, verse 35 is where we are.
Yes. And in Matthew 22, we can read one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. So that Pharisee lawyer that we just talked about, he's testing Jesus with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Remember, we're not just talking about the 10, we're talking about the 613. So which out of the 613 are the greatest? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this is really important, this ending sentence. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
And I love what Jesus does here. He's asked a hard question. He's asked a question that's intended to trip him up, and he points back to the Old Testament. He points back to the Torah, which these Pharisees and Sadducees, they would have known the Old Testament. And the Old Testament Torah, that's our first 5 books, like in our Bible. And so Jesus points back to Deuteronomy, where Moses is coming down from a mountain. He's got 10 commandments. God has given him these 10 commandments. And Jesus is pointing back to that. And he references and says, here it is. Like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Like, that's a direct quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6. And then he says, or Moses in Deuteronomy 6 says, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. And Jesus is going right back there. He's pointing them back to what they knew. Like, he was reiterating something that was like ingrained in them. They would have known this. And what's he saying? He's saying, love God first. Love God first. Love God with your whole self, like mind, soul, heart. It's not me, myself, and I. It's not 3 separate things. It's my whole self. Mind, soul, heart. These together create like a holistic view of who I am. They're not 3 separate things. And so Jesus is saying, like, love God first with all of who you are. Love God first with this holistic mindset. Love God first, period. Exclamation point. Underline it, like highlight it, right? Like, love God first. This is what Jesus is saying. And then he more or less is saying, like, consistently, love God first.
And then Jesus continues and he adds on an equally important part. So if like love God first is 1A, then this is 1B. And it says, and similarly, love your neighbor as yourself. So yes, love God first, but then we can demonstrate our love for God by how we love our neighbor. And in the Old Testament, you demonstrated your love for God by following the law. You demonstrated your love for God by following those 613 laws. But Jesus says right here, love God first, and then how you love others demonstrates how you love me. And just so we're not confused, Jesus adds on all the laws and prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Jesus is essentially saying loving God first and your neighbor similarly is the backbone to the law and prophets that you, Pharisee lawyer, put so much weight in. You might even say, like, Jesus is saying something like, put me first. And then your love for me will help you love others. And if you do that, then you uphold the purpose of the law.
Are you hearing what we've heard all week? right? Like, it's really pretty simple. And I told you it was going to be simple. Love God first, and then love others. Consistently loving God first helps us love others best. And that's what we heard all week long. That's what I hope you're hearing today. But you might be hearing something slightly different. You might be hearing, stop loving the rules first. Some of us need to hear that today. Like, I need to stop loving the rules first because I need to love God first. Some of us need to stop loving the religious rules first because we need to learn how to love God first, because when we love God first, we love each other better. Like, some of us, we need to stop loving what's right, or maybe we need to stop loving what's right to us and allow there to be mistakes made. But that's okay because we love God first, and when we love God first, we're going to be able to love others best. Some of us need to let go of what we think is most important, and we need to love God first and align ourselves with what is most important with the heart of God, because when we do that, we're going to be able to love others best. And the reality is, like, the greatest thing that any of us can do, the greatest thing that we can do, the greatest thing that you can do for any relationship that you have is to love God first. The greatest thing that you can do for any relationship you have is loving God first. I recently heard Craig Rochelle say, you can't change them. And I think we all somewhat know that to be true. But he says, you can't change them, so stop trying, right? Like, and I think what he's saying when he says that is the best thing you can do for your relationships is to become a better you. And how do you become a better you? You become a better you by loving God first. You become a better version of yourself when you consistently love God first. And I know that it sounds simple. We've said that a couple times. Like, it sounds simple, but it's really, really hard to do. It's really hard to do because the reality is, like, all of us, I'm sure if I said, like, raise your hand if you love God, all of us would throw a hand in the air. Thank you for those of you that actually did it. But I know, like, all of us, I ask that question and all of us immediately, we're like, yes, I love God. But, like, is God always, without a doubt, without hesitation, your first love? Is God always, without hesitation, your first love? Is there something else that sneaks in there? Maybe the question, better version of that question is like, is God consistently your first relationship? Like, some of us, we have lots of relationships, and we might think, like, this is my top 10 list of friends, and when we think of our top 10 list of friends or top 10 list of family members, like, is God even on our top 10? Do we consider God a relationship, or do we think of God as like a religion? Is God consistently your first relationship? Is God prioritized ahead of your spouse? Is God prioritized ahead of your children? Is God prioritized ahead of your neighbor, your coworker, your classmate, your best friend? Like, is God your first priority? That's the question.
Because we all can get better. No matter our answer to that question, we all can get better at loving God first. And when we love God first, our hearts are changed, our spirit is changed, our nature is changed, how we respond to things is changed, how we react, how we interact, it's all changed. Because we might become like more patient. We might have more grace for someone who drives us crazy. We might be quicker to forgive. Or we might develop self-control. And let's be honest, we can't do this on our own, but we might have more self-control. We might even become more compassionate. We might have more empathy. We might be more gentle, especially in those really hard situations. Because when we have those changed hearts, and when we are more a spiritually alive person, we'll naturally lead with patience and grace and self-control in our relationships. And that's how we love others best. But it only happens when we love God first. And so today, we cannot be okay leaving here the same way and okay with exactly who we've been. Let's commit today to being consistent. Let's commit today to saying, yes, God, you are my first love, and consistently loving God first. Let's commit to a Bible reading plan. Let's commit to praying for our relationships. Let's stop telling others to change and instead commit to being changed ourselves. Because consistently loving God first helps us love others best. And that's the best thing you can do for your relationships. Let's pray.
God, thank you. Thank you for seeing us, for knowing us, calling us by name to yourself, and inviting us to have a relationship with you. God, would that relationship become our first priority? God, would you change us through that relationship? Where we need self-control, God, would you give us that? Where we need gentleness, would you give us that? Where we need some amount of forgiveness or empathy, would you give us that? Would you give us patience? God, would you awaken us? Would you call us into a deeper connection with yourself? Would you change us so that we can love others best, so that our relationships would improve? They'd find real meaning and real purpose. God, convict us of this today. Convict us of this throughout the week. We pray this in your name. Amen.